So, Blender, and using it for 3D printing. Blender has a long and storied history, and I know very little of it. It's a couple of decades old, was open source out of being a proprietary piece of software inside of some company. It was effectively given away to the community, but with the understanding that Tom Rosendahl, that took it on, would build up the community around it in order to build it up and make it better. And it's now grown up into a suite of tools under the same Blender banner that's so expansive. You can do video editing, 3D modeling, camera tracking. The only thing you can't really do is audio editing, but everything else you can may yet get at it. There's even a game engine in there. You can build games within Blender.
I didn't know you could do. It's got you can use it for as a standalone video editor.
You can load up video clips into it, do transitions, do frame rate changes, do masking.
It's a full NLE, not video editor.
Right.
It's a pain in the arse.
It's brilliant.
It doesn't do frame rates nicely. It doesn't do frame rates at all properly. If you've got mixed frame rates, things it won't scale properly, and it has problems with audio and things not being in the same frame rate.
It does if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, okay.
Which is the answer to everything, even the language.
So, one of the things that people hit their shins on when they come into using Blender is the fact that the program itself is effectively keyboard driven. When you're using Blender, you've got a 107 button mouse, really, because you've got your left hand on the keyboard all the time, your right hand on the mouse. And to that end, it's got a hell of a lot of keyboard shortcuts, some of which require muscle stretches to be able to get to. So when you start off learning Blender, it's not even really about where the buttons are, because there are some buttons, but you just don't use them. It's too slow. You use the keyboard shortcuts because they're very, very fast, which does put a bit of a learning curve on getting started, because you've really got to commit them to memory. And the other thing that new users fall over on is that selecting things is done with the right mouse button.
Okay.
By default, the right mouse button is to select. The left mouse button is okay on actions, and it scrubs things around in the timeline, and you can use it for some grabbing, but it's all the UI stuff you use it for interacting with. The right mouse button is for interacting with objects in 3D space, and you select them with the right mouse button.
So anything around the view pane?
Around here, if you want to pick something up...
sorry, not around. Outside the view pane,
outside here,
left mouse.
Left click. Inside here, if you want to select something like this light here, right click to select.
Okay.
Right click to select the camera, right click to select this object, right click to select a vertex within that object. Now there's a lot of other selection tools as well, like box select, which you hit B on the keyboard, drag a box. Circle select, you hit C on the keyboard, paint over the top. But primarily you're looking at right mouse to select individual things, shift right mouse to select multiple things. And then I could go through a whole list of the keyboard shortcuts, but I won't. As I was explaining before, I've got another bit of software showing you which keys I'm pressing in the top right of the screen there. So when I press G to grab and move this cube, you'll see it says G up at the top right. And when I'm done with moving it, I press left click to drop it. Or if I want to cancel that operation, I right click to let go of it, and it goes back where it was. So when you're in an operation, left click for OK, right click for cancel. When you're outside of an operation, right click to select. The camera tools are the same as FreeCAD in camera mode, in that you can use the middle mouse button to tumble around, use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and shift, I believe, and middle mouse to pan. But you've also got your numpad for getting to top, front, and side
as well.
Within the numpad as well as top, right and side and front, you've got the ones in between 8, 2 and 4 and 6 to rotate around in degrees. So what I wanted to do in this talk is go through a few things that, if you're using Blender to build or Blender to edit your models and then taking it through to Cura, there's a few things that will trip you up. And the first one I wanted to look at was bad scaling. Now, there was a jokey comment made earlier about the scaling units in Blender. Inside of Blender, it's got a unit called a blender unit, and it's a universal unit. If there's something that's 2 by 2 by 2 like this cube, it's 2 blender units tall, 2 blender units across, and 2 blender units deep. You can export that with blender units being equal to millimeters by default, and that's exactly what you'll get. If you send this out to OBJ format and then bang it into Cura, that will be 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters. The quickest way I've found to get into a position where it's comfortable both with the scaling in Blender and the scaling in Cura is to always export your objects with a scale of 10. So you end up with one blender unit being equal to 1 centimeter in your model, and it works quite well. And the way that you do that, if I take this cube, go export to OBJ, and scroll to the bottom of the settings and set the scale units to 10. Now, Blender will remember that for the whole of this session. Every time you export whilst this version of Blender is loaded, it will still be on scale 10. But if you close Blender down and open it up again, it will go back to 1. I don't know if there is a way of saving that. If there is, I don't know what it is. The other thing that you should always do when you're exporting from Blender as OBJ is it defaults to not selection only. So if you do an export now, you'll get the camera, the light, the object you've got selected, and every other object on every layer within that scene.
Yeah.
So if you tick selection only, then when you export that object, you'll just get the one you've got selected. So hopping over to Cura now that I've got it scaled by 10, if I load up cube.obj, you'll see it's 20 millimeters across. The reason I like to get that right is, especially this version of Cura, it updates the GUI with every key press inside of the scale. So if you want to scale to 1.572 and you've got a really complex object, it's going to take ages to get to the end of that scale operation, because it'll scale it to 1, scale it to 1.5, scale it to 1.57, and then scale it to 1.572. Because it doesn't wait for you to press enter, it just updates.
Oh, okay.
It's really, really, really irritating. When you've got a big object and you just want to tweak the scale a little bit, you want to add 0.25 to it, it takes forever. So if you get it right on the export, you don't have to muck about with it in Cura, and it just makes life so much easier. So that's proper scaling. There is a way to set Blender's world units to metric. It's in here somewhere. Unit presets. Length, metric, imperial. Imperial, can you believe it? Scale by 3.8 inches. What does that mean? Angles you can set to degrees and radians. But I find that if I set that to metric and I say now I can set my object to 5 centimeters, that grid floor is set to a certain default size, and it's nice to be able to see it. And by the time I take it over into meters, the grid floor is so small that my object basically just engulfs it, and it just makes it really hard to see. So all I do is I say in my mind, one blender unit is 1 centimeter, and I'm going to export it times 10, and then everything comes out right. Just before I move on to something else, it's worth noting that if I hit Z on the keyboard, we can go into wireframe mode. It's intensely useful to be able to swap to and from wireframe mode really quickly. If you've got something that's occluded that you want to select, say I'm in edit mode and I want to pick that vertex at the back there, but I don't want to swap my camera around to the other side, I go into wireframe, right click that, I've got that vertex on the other side of the object. So you'll see me doing that quite a lot. I'm going to demonstrate some things here. When you build a mesh in Blender, it's not like parameterized modeling. You are literally putting the vertices of that mesh where they need to be. You can do that with edges, vertices and faces. If you press Control Tab, you can say what you want to select. At the moment I'm in vertex select mode. I'll go into edge select mode and I can select edges and do interesting things with those edges, like grab them and move them around. If I'm in face mode, you'll see the little dots on each face appear, and you can grab and move each of those faces around. So the first issue that when I was doing some research for this and trying to break Cura effectively, and the first thing that I came up with is if you take one of those faces and flip it around the other way. So there's this concept of the normal angle of each face. Now, edges and vertices have normal angles as well, but they're a bit more complex. The normal angle to each face is at the angle perpendicular to that face. So for this edge on this face on the top, it would be straight up. It would be the normal angle. Originally, the face on this side here was pointing outwards. I've flipped the normal, so it's now pointing inwards. If I now export that as an OBJ and bang it into Cura.
Ooh.
I don't know if you were over this. Why OBJ, not STL?
Just because that's the format I'm familiar with.
Okay.
There really isn't much difference from a functional perspective, but I use OBJ in a lot of other things, so I just
No, it's fine. Okay. I wondered if there was a reason for the preference. Just it's
no particular reason. That's fine. Now I think, would you believe it? This time it's worked.
Make sure it's got the face on the other
Yeah.
side.
No, what normally happened when I was testing this at home is that it simply wouldn't render the cube. It would load it up and then you would see nothing on the print bed until you went to layer, and then it would appear, and then you'd go back to normal and it would be there. It was as if there was some glitch on loading it when it couldn't tell that it was solid. So you might see that, depending on the version of Cura you're using. If you download an object and there's some inconsistent normals within that object, you load it into Cura and it's got issues. It either doesn't render or you have to go to layer mode. Now that's a minor problem because visually it will appear eventually if you play around with it. Where you get bigger problems is if you've got a slightly more complex shape. Let's add a couple of spheres. So if I add a UV sphere and then go into edit mode, select all of those faces and duplicate them, Shift D, and then grab them on the y-axis and scale them down. Let's say I'm making a little head and I scale it, and then I go a bit too far and I scale it out the other side, but I didn't really notice that I'd done that. What I've effectively done there is I've turned it inside out. So because I've scaled through 0, all the normals are now backwards. So if I export that, and you won't tell immediately that there's a big issue, but there is. So you'll see that kind of looks right. You know, there's nothing really wrong with that. The orientation's slightly off. Actually, when you're exporting OBJ, there is a little drop-down box to tell it which way is up. At the moment, I've got it set to Y, I think, so that's why it comes out slightly weirdly rotated. But if I were to go into layer mode and scrub down through the layers, you'll see there's a bit of a problem there. Where the spheres intersect, it's not solid. It's cut one sphere out of the other and then solidified the rest of the sphere on top. So you'll actually end up with two parts.
Oh, I see.
You'll end up with a dome cap on top of a domed hole inside of a sphere. When what you really wanted is one big compound dual sphere head. Now if I pop that back into Blender, and the way that you fix it is, and this is true of quite a lot of things in Blender, is that you'll select something and then you want to perform an operation on all of those things, but you can't quite remember the keyboard combination, so you hit space and you start typing, and you'll get a list of the things that start with that word. Flip normals is the thing you want to use to flip the normal to the other side. But actually what's easier, if you've got something as simple as this, is if you select every face and press Ctrl N. It makes all the normals consistent throughout that whole model.
Makes all the normals normal.
It makes the normals normal.
Yeah.
It makes every part of the mesh agree on which direction is out and which direction is in.
That's problematic because
It can be.
because if the inside wins or the opposite of the normal wins,
It actually doesn't matter. If you
if everything's
provided,
pointing in the same
Exactly.
way, Cura
Precisely.
will not have
Precisely.
an issue. Okay.
as long as they're consistent throughout the model, it doesn't matter that Blender thinks in is out and out is in, as long as every part of your model agrees. Now keep alt-tabbing, but I'm remoted in, so that just takes me out of that remote desktop. So we'll load that new head that I've just created, and we'll see the difference that makes. Did I not finish exporting that? Because I keep alt-tabbing. So all those normals are correct now. I'm going to export. Head.obj selected, scale times 10, export obj, and then go back to Cura. I'm going to actually delete this model. I don't know if it's just... Oh, there's two. Because I didn't delete the original. So this should be the one that I just finished editing, and let's see what a difference it's made. It goes all the way, that's one contiguous shape. And it would be a real pain to make a model with inconsistent normals, take it into Cura, think, oh, looks alright, print it out, and the arm drops off.
And if you didn't even know what you'd done wrong, that would be
exactly. It would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
So that's bad scaling covered, inconsistent normals covered. As I was saying earlier, you can do that Control N operation, and that'll make everything right. But that only works if you've got a really simple object. If it can programmatically tell that on any given point this is out and that's in, it works beautifully. It doesn't work on very, very complex objects. I don't have an example of it not working, but when it doesn't work, what you have to do is you have to go into face select mode, get the faces with the bad normals, and flip them manually. It can be a pain, but there's a nice way of displaying the normals on the faces, which is this button down here, which allows you to see which direction each of the faces is pointing. And you'll see all those little blue lines that were there on these faces have now vanished onto the inside of the model. If I go into wireframe mode, it's a bit hard to see, but you'll see that they are pointing inwards rather than outwards.
Sea urchin, is it?
It's a little bit like a sea urchin. And so I would then select those, flip them back out, everything's well again. So that's inconsistent normals. Another problem that you can find is that when you're building a structure, you will extrude bits out and go like that, and you might find that at some point you've ended up with a bit that's so thin that it doesn't actually slice.
Mm.
And then you'll end up with two parts. I could demonstrate that in Cura, but I think you'll be able to understand what that means.
Yeah, if it goes below your layer height or whatever your nozzle thing is, yeah, it makes sense.
Now I don't know that it should be the case that it does that. Maybe there should be some option where you could tell Cura if you detect areas that are simply too small to deal with, that maybe it could do something about it. But if you've got a nice simple object like this one, the easiest way to fix it is just to get those faces and make them bigger. And one of the easiest ways to do that, if it's nicely aligned like this, is to scale, but only scale on certain axes. And one of the beauties of Blender is it's very easy to do that. If I want to scale these faces on the x-axis, I press S, then X. And then as I move my mouse, they're only scaling on the x-axis. If I want to scale them in the y-axis, I press S and then Y, and I think you can imagine what happens when I press S and Z. But there's a bit more than that. If you want to scale on two axes at once, you shift select the one that you don't want to scale on. So I don't want to scale on the Y. I want to make this thicker, but not on the y-axis. S shift Y gives me just X and Z. So S shift Y, scale it up a bit, and now that might print where it wouldn't have done before. That's okay as far as it goes for a simple object like that. But if it's a really complex object, you might find that it's more effort than it's worth to go in and move all those faces and get them into the right space so that they'll print. At which point, it's perfectly reasonable to add another mesh, let's say a sphere in this case, and get it where you want it, and just thicken it up with extra objects. You could do that. That would be absolutely fine. And as long as you select all those objects as you export, they'll all come into Cura as one. So you've effectively thickened it up by adding more material. Another way to do it is to use the sculpt tools. Now for that I am going to need a bit more geometry, so I'm going to just dip into the modifier pane and add a subdivision surface modifier. And all that's going to do is run a subdivision surface algorithm on the original mesh and create new geometry that smooths it down to a rounded. It is almost a spinning top. It's kind of like a deflated balloon. And so that section there would be a pain to go about, grabbing the faces and pulling them this way and that. But if I go into sculpt mode, you get these brushes, these sculpting brushes. You can do some really interesting things with these. The best one for this one is inflate. And if I just hit that with a quick inflate, you'll see it inflates that region.
So it takes all the faces and switch them one way. Like ow.
Moves them in their normals.
It does move them in their normals, in the average of the normals under the pointer.
Yeah.
So when I press F and scale that black spot up and down, that's the area of effect. And what it'll do is internally it'll run some maths on all the faces underneath that area. And based on the outcome of that maths, it will then apply a step. And the amount of the step that it applies is controlled by the strength. So I could say, make it a really strong inflate effect. And each of those steps you can see it's jumping up by a certain amount. Or I can make a really subtle strength effect. And that would just inflate by a little bit. Now sculpting is something that is best done with a pressure sensitive input device like a stylus. But if you're just doing something like this, you can get away with using a mouse. What you'll find if you are using a mouse is that you really are playing with the strength of the brush quite a lot. Because you don't have that pressure sensitivity to be able to do a light stroke, you're going to have to come over here and crank it down. Fortunately, there is a quick keyboard shortcut because, hey, this is Blender. F will do the size of the brush, Shift F will do the strength of the brush. From very, very weak down to very, very strong. So that's the very strong brush, Shift F, that's the very, very weak brush. You almost can't see it. So that's inflate. If it was the kind of model where it made more sense to just grab a bit of it and move it, you can put the grab mode on, just grab bits, move them around, and you'll see that by default it's also symmetrical in one axis. So as I move things around, you see that symmetry taking effect. It has some really interesting and complex symmetry modes. Rotational symmetry in particular is quite interesting. You can say, give me a rotational symmetry around this axis of 10. And when I grab a bit, that will come out, and so will 9 other points around that circumference. Which allows you to do interesting things like vases. You can sculpt a curve down a vase, and it will make a copy of that curve around the whole circumference of the mesh. So that was just for thickening up a bit. There's a heck of a lot more to the sculpture.
It's only undo brush.
It's a smooth tool, and that will take the area underneath the brush and just average them out.
Right.
Now you can do that in edit mode, and I was going to talk about that in a little bit actually. What was the next problem? That was thin sections. My last problem I was going to talk about is rough surfaces. You get this when you do a 3D scan of something. Quite often you'll get, say, a coffee mug, you'll 3D scan it, and the surface will look okay, but it's got perturbations, and you just want to smooth those out a little bit. There is a reasonably easy way to do this. Let me just prepare a plane with some perturbations on it. So I create a plane, and then I want to subdivide that, and let's subdivide it quite a few times. This actually leads me into talking about proportional editing, which is quite good. Edit mode in Blender means that you can see all the things that make up that mesh. This is object mode. I can just see the meshes that I've got in the scene. When you go into edit mode on a mesh, you get to see what makes it up. You can go into vertex mode, pick a vertex, move it around, hide it, etc. If you wanted to move quite a lot of these things at once, you can multi-select them like that, and then grab them. What if you don't want to move all of them by the same amount? That's when proportional editing comes in. There's a little selector down here, which is the proportional editing mode, and if I turn that on, you also get another selector, which is the fall off. Now when I grab this single vertex and move it, the rest of them move by the amount specified by the fall off curve. What I was going to use to generate these perturbations is a random fall off. So what that does is it takes every vertex under that brush, randomly selects whether or not to apply a different level of fall off to it, and then when I grab that, they'll all move by a random amount, but in the same direction. So they're all moving, just they're randomly obeying that move, how much they obey it. So if I do that a few times, we'll end up with a nice rough surface, like the kind of thing that you'd get if you use a Kinect to scan an object, because they never come out clean. and this is what you'll end up with. So you look at that and you think, well, that's okay, but if that was on the surface of my model, you would see that in a print. You would see the edges going in and out. So there's a couple of ways to deal with this. I could, quite reasonably, because I've only got a plane, and it's already oriented in the XY? Yeah, in the XY plane, I could just select all of those and scale them vertically by 0. Scale Z 0. Done. Now they are scaled by Z 0. They are flat. And you can tell that they're flat because when I go back into flat shaded mode, you can't see any weirdness going on there.
That orange line seemed
Yeah.
a little
What happened
zigzaggy.
when I was dragging them up, I didn't just drag them up. I just pressed grab when I pulled these out and moved my mouse up. Now because my camera isn't oriented exactly straight onto it, they're moving up and across a bit.
Yeah.
So when I scale those back down on the Z, they're not coming back in on the X and Y.
Okay.
That's why that edge didn't look quite right. And that's one of the problems with trying to do that. Another way of doing it would be to, again, go into sculpt mode. Oh, actually, there's one other way I'll show you before I do that, because I like sculpt mode, so that's my favourite. I'll leave that to the end. Another way to do it is to select the vertices that are rough and go into... It's difficult this, because if I say go into the W menu, the specials menu, you're not going to really know what I mean, but really you're pressing W on the keyboard. Another way of getting to that is type in smooth from the space thing. Smooth? Smooth. Type in smooth, and you've got smooth vertex there. Once you've done that, they'll be a bit smoother. It runs an algorithm across all those vertices and goes, let's smooth them out a little bit. If you want to run that again, you can press Shift R, which is the keyboard combination for repeat. I'll repeat that smooth operation, repeat. Now they are all quite smooth. And if I go back into object mode, you can see there's barely any surface perturbation there. Now, if I undo that, the way that I would do it, because you're never going to be faced with just a plane, especially if you're doing 3D printing, this is going to be part of a larger mesh. And all of these perturbations are going to be much smaller in their delta from average than the changes in your mesh. Hopefully you've got a complex enough model that these little bumps aren't completely obscuring all the detail of your model. That being the case, if you go into sculpt mode and just hold down Shift, when you stroke, you're doing a smooth operation, and it's just going to smooth all that out beautifully. And that's now pretty much flat. Certainly to within tolerance of when you 3D print it, it's going to basically look flat. So that's rough surfaces. I've kind of run out of the kinds of errors that I came up against when going into Cura. But something I said earlier, which is quite interesting with respect to Blender, is everything is undoable. And that's not quite true, as was pointed out, in that undos themselves are redoable. So, yeah, you're right, not everything is undoable. But one thing that, I've used Blender now for probably a decade, and if I try and use another application, I can't do it. And I said, if you're going to get into Blender, that's the one downside. You will fall in love with the interface so much that when you go and use something else, your blood will boil. It will be slow. It will be pointless. You will be clicking on a 10 pixel wide button when you should have just pushed a key on the keyboard. It's ridiculous that nobody else has taken up these UI methodologies. They really should. And one of them is being able to undo a selection is incredibly important. Imagine that there are 10 or 15 of these vertices I want to select, and the only way to do it, because of the way they're laid out, is to individually select them. So I select that one, and 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 I definitely want that one. And oops, I selected the wrong one. Any other application, I hit Control Z, it's going to take them all away.
Yeah.
This one, it undoes the last select I did, and that's all. I can undo again, and undo the previous select, and the previous select, and the previous select. It's just...
So it doesn't group an operation. So when you're doing select, it's multiple selects that it drops in the undo part stack.
Yes,
not
every individual select, and you
So
can roll
another
back.
combination for undoing the last sort of sequence that you do.
Yeah, you hold down Control Z for a while.
Oh.
You can, yeah. There isn't one for that. I mean, I think there is an operation history somewhere, but I don't use that. It's such a deep application that there could very well be, and I wouldn't even know. You know, it's in there somewhere. The documentation's reasonably good, but if you were to read it from end to end, it would take forever. So, really, the best way to learn Blender, I've found, is to just do tutorials. Find something that looks kind of interesting and do a tutorial on it. The thing that I use the most, and I do a lot of sculpting, is called dynamic topology. And I'll just quickly demonstrate what that is, and then I'll probably close on that. This cube has got a certain number of vertices. There isn't enough detail there from a data perspective for me to say I want the middle of one of those faces to bulge out. There just isn't enough information there. There's not enough vertices. Now I could subdivide it and subdivide it and subdivide it, and then grab the bit and pull it out and say, well, let's turn that fall off random for a start. Stick it on something else and pull that out like that and say, all right, that's come out like that. And from a slightly more engineering background, a less artistic background, that might well be the way that you do it. I like the sculpting tools, and my favourite part about that, it was actually quite recently added, just in the past couple of years. That's recent in Blender time. You are now able to activate what's called dynamic topology, and if I turn that on now, you'll see there was a slight change in the shading of the object. And that's because the first thing it does when you do that is it triangulates the object. All of those faces were quads to start with, they're now triangles. And that's just because the dynamic topology mathematics only really works with triangular faces. So now that I've done that, and I look at the Dyntopo settings, I've got a detail size of 12 pixels. That's telling Blender that for every 12 pixels on the screen, create a new face. So when I go and use the blob tool on the middle of this face, and go like that, and then look at it in wireframe, you'll see it's created the new topology, but only where I was actually doing the sculpting operation,
right.
and only enough to give me the detail I wanted where I wanted it.
So it will triangulate deeper only where you're affecting.
And it'll do that to the level specified in the detail size. If I take that down to, say, 4 pixels, and do basically the same operation but over here, you'll see it's a little bit smoother, and you'll see why when I go into wireframe, because that's much, much denser than up there on the top face. That was at 12 pixels, and that was at, what was that? 4.
The machine is now crying.
Yeah. Now you'll probably guess that if it's measured in pixels, well surely that means that it matters how zoomed in you are, and it does. That 4 pixels gives me a certain detail at a certain zoom level, but out here it'll give me a completely different level of detail, because 4 pixels means something different when you zoomed in to when you zoomed out.
Yeah.
For that reason, that's what's called relative detail. You can have constant detail, and that's measured in a certain percentage. I believe that's to do with the percentage of the overall mesh size, but I'm not entirely certain. In any event, the smaller detail size will give you smaller faces, a larger detail size will give you larger, and that constant detail is completely independent of how zoomed in you are. Now, I don't use that myself because for artistic purposes it helps to be able to say I'm going to zoom to a level where I'm looking at pores on skin, and so my relative detail still makes sense because I'm actually going to zoom right in order to do that anyway. And I wouldn't ever use a textured brush to put pores on skin from really zoomed out.
No, because
you wouldn't do it.
Craters instead of pores.
Well,
Face.
So the sculpt tools are great fun. Just as an example, this is something that I was sculpting the other day. It's not my best work, but it's reasonably decent, and you'll see that there are different levels of detail depending on which bits I've done a lot of work on. Around the eyes, the ears less so because I hate doing ears. I just hate doing ears. And that was effectively sculpted from a cube.
Okay, you started with a cube.
Let me just make. No, I started with a sphere.
Okay.
I'm looking in the hierarchy. It was a sphere, but whereas with classical, say, if you were chipping granite off a block, you'd start with a block and you'd chip in. Generally speaking, with this, you start with something smaller than what you want to create, and you pull out.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing that can be achieved with sculpting. I'm by no means the best sculptor out there. There are some amazing sculptors using Blender. If sculpting is your thing though, and you find that you are very good at it, Blender technically doesn't have all the best features. Something like ZBrush might be better for you, but it's good enough for me. I really enjoy it.
Still remember some of the stuff that you started doing like some really long years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
So you were still posting it on G+, wasn't it?
G+, yeah, so many years ago. It was quite a while ago that I did this. I think this should be a model of. What have I done there? What did I do there? What am I trying to achieve? Oh, I know what I was doing. I was taking. I was going to do a Boolean operation. We've seen a lot of Boolean operations today. And what I was trying to do is take this really high complex model and just take the face off it, so I could make a mold. I was going to 3D print this inside out and make a candle mold. And it did actually work, but it was really hard to get the wax out of it. It tended to break his nose off. But that, if I delete that, that's my Yanis Varoufakis, ex-Greek finance minister. Just because I'm a bit of a lefty and I quite like it. And you'll see the stubble on his head was done with an alpha texture. So that's what I do with Blender, coupled with the few things that can trip you up when you're doing it for 3D printing.
Good.
Any questions?
Probably a stupid one, but how I think the way I've evolved in trying to get something made, and usually before the whole 3D printing stuff, and before the whole me knowing that there was stuff to do it in a parameterized fashion, I would do something like I did this. I had it in my mind, I cut it in my mind, and then design it on a piece of paper, or just cut the pieces of wood accordingly, and then just glue it up.
Yeah.
But then, having a little bit of experience with OpenSCAD and FreeCAD, one of the things that I really like is the fact that you can name a number, and then you can change that number, and then have an instant feedback into that. Is there a way to have, let's say, global variable numbers, so you can then say, okay, let's make this edge of the cube just this edge or something?
As far as I'm aware, there's no variabilization whatsoever in the dimensions of things. Now, the dimensions of things I haven't even shown. They do exist. There's a scale value. There's the dimensions output. At the moment, this is 2 units by 2 units by 2 units. If I were to grab a face and pull it out some random amount on the y-axis, then when I go back, it's now 2 by 4.508 by 2. So the dimensions do exist, but they're and you can type them in. I could set that to 1.5 units, and it would scale to 1.5 units.
So you're more on a object property kind of landscape than a parameterized.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now there are constraints and things. You can copy the transform from one object to another and constrain them in that way, but they're not CAD constraints for mesh generation. They're more inter-mesh constraints for animation. So you might say this object is a child of that one, which means when I move this, then this one moves. But they're primarily aimed at animators and CG artists rather than mechanical design.
I think the thing that I have to take in consideration in Blender is that you're working with meshes, not really 3D objects.
Well, not
pure.
Pure.
Yeah.
not pure geometry,
Yeah.
triangulized or
Yeah.
meshed.
This Blender is to CAD as say Photoshop is to Inkscape, insofar as to say this isn't vectorized in that way. This is down to the vertex. You know, in your CAD applications, you don't know where the vertices are.
Yeah.
Because there really aren't any. They're mathematical expressions. You've got a formula that says this curve exists, but you don't have a point on that curve that's actually defined that you can grab. And that is a big difference. Now, actually, to be fair, that's not 100% true, because Blender does do some stuff with what's called non-uniform rational B-splines, or NURBS. NURBS surfaces. They are pure mathematics. There's no vertices in there. There's control points, but it's all mathematics. So these are, as you might say, mathematically designed shapes, and they can be 3D solids as well. So you can do that. I don't. So I don't know a great deal about that.
But it must be good for doing sculptural, artistic things still to be printed out. But
Yeah.
Um,
And of course, once you've learned the interface, all of the ways in which you interact with the interface are transferable to the other parts of the software that you also use.
Yeah.
So, say you go over and you want to do some video editing over in the video editing side, which is, say, here, then once you've got some video clips in this timeline, you can use B for box select and select the video clips. You can use C for circle select. Actually, you can't in this instance. You can use B for box select. And you can press G to grab something. You can press S to scale it. And all of the interface functionality that you expect from the 3D view and from the curve editor, it all works in the video editor and vice versa.
That's really nice to have a consistent UI.
If you ever do any animating, and I'm in the wrong place to be talking about animating, but if you do, this idea of interpolation curves is brilliant. Take keyframe animation, like stop motion animation, and you say, I'm going to take a photo here and I'm going to take a photo there, and the leg will have moved from here to there. That's fine, you've got 2 frames. If you do that in Blender, you end up with a curve for every parameter that you've changed about that leg. That it's moved in the x-axis, that it's rotated in the y-axis, and the curve exists on a graph that you can manipulate.
Ooh.
And you can say, well, actually, I don't want it to move in a curved fashion, I want it to be linear, I want it to be a really fast movement. So you just set that Bezier to a linear rather than a curve. And if you ever do animation, it's just a brilliant way of working. There's so many really nice UI elements in Blender, it's crazy. You get into the texturing side of things, it's node driven. So have you ever used something that's node driven? You drop an operation onto a graph and you plug bits into each other, and that specifies how it works. I'll just do a very quick look at that because it's really worth knowing. If I add a new material to this and then switch over to the cycles render and then hit use nodes, then when I go over to here and I've got this material, it's got a diffuse BSDF, bidirectional surface diffusion function, or something like that. That is how a surface responds to light if it is a diffuse surface. I can add another one, a shader, call it a glossy BSDF. Now, if I want to say that the material is actually just that glossy and not the diffuse, I drag from there and I drop into there. Ding, done. Now, if I want to say it's actually a mixture of the two, I'll add a mix shader, put it in between, plug the 2 into it, and now it's a mixture of the 2, controlled by this factor. And you'll notice that the factor has an input as well. If I add something else, like say a Fresnel effect, that can control the factor. And you end up with these huge node graphs that define really complex behaviour.
But you go at it node by node, which makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
The alternative to it being node-based, and it does exist, is if you go over into the materials pane here, you've got it as a kind of set of drop-downs.
Yeah.
Which you could do it that way, but that makes more sense over here in the node graph.
And it means you can react to other things like another curve that is emulating heat,
Yeah.
for example,
Yeah.
that you've defined elsewhere.
Well, you can insert attributes like, say, the vertex colors or some vector from somewhere, and you can change the color of an object by its position. And it's so deep, and there's so many things that you can do. I couldn't possibly go into even a tenth of them, but I just had to talk about this node graph idea because it's being taken up now. The Unreal Editor Unreal Game Engine, uses a node-based system, not just for its material design, but also for its programming and logic. So you design in a node graph like this one how objects react to each other and how all the AI works. So this I don't know that it was the first place to do this sort of thing.
No,
It
no.
might have been, but it's certainly helped popularise it.
There's some musical software that uses Node.
I imagine there
This
is,
brings me back to when we were doing OP, and those are the objects, and then there's arrows for the when you have a child and all that.
Yeah.
And it also brings
Like
me,
UML.
absolutely, that was what I was the acronym that I was missing, like UML. But I've also seen people do these types of node things with, I think it was something related to Y Combinator where you had two feeds and you want to intermesh two feeds into one feed. There was a web tool for it where you said grab me a feed and grab me another feed, and then we'll have a combinator node that will just pick relative words from both feeds but present it as a unique feed. So basically, if you wanted to pick, you have like 3 feeds, and those feeds talk or have more than one topic on it. Like you have 3 guys, and they're mainly computer language related, but they talk about politics and they talk about whatever their kids doing, and you just want to pick the tags that says language, and then you would drop those 3 feeds as 3 nodes. Then you would have another node that will say, just get the ones with the tag language, and then you had your feed that would combine that.
Like filters.
Sorry?
Like filter.
Like a filter, yes.
Yeah, you're talking RSS planets there. That's one of the things
Yeah.
that they do.
I think Y Combinator was, I don't remember.
I think Y Combinator fell out of the old planets idea for what
I think that's it. Yeah, and now you also have the graphical way to program,
Yeah.
which
Things
it's not
things
a lot
Scratch.
like that, but
It's
kind
similar.
of.
It is similar. Just the last point for the programmers. It's written in C and C++, but the whole UI is Python.
Yeah.
Right.
And so if you want to write a little script that when you hit a button it makes all your objects jump up by 10 meters, it's damned easy to do.
Yeah.
You can actually write into this interactive Python console at the bottom there, and when you press enter, the effect will occur in your 3D scene.
So you can do. I want to suddenly make all everything. Yeah. Select all and invert normals.
Yeah, you can. In fact, there's no reason at all why you shouldn't, as we were discussing earlier, build a really accurate mesh from programmatic instructions written in Python that generate the vertices, join them up with edges, join those edges into faces, and then output however you want it.
So you can actually open scan it.
You could OpenSCAD this, but you'd be writing Python code
You don't use OpenSCAD, use PySCAD.
Yeah.
Which is the Python underlying module that runs OpenSCAD.
You certainly could.
So you can generate the STL. 2 random things. 1, is the undo history part of the file, or is that only during the session?
Ooh, that's a good question. Should we find out?
Yeah.
Why not? Let's move it over there, move it over there, move it over there, and then save my blend file. Oh, if anyone's into game development, the blend file format is, I would say, compatible, that's probably the best word to use, with Unity, insofar as if you use Unity to write games, you can import the blend file as an asset, and all of the models and the materials and things, it will at least attempt to bring them all into Unity, and they're already where you put them. And I've just been doing that recently, trying to make a VR thing, and it works really well. We'll just fire Blender back up, and let's see if we can undo those translations. Blender.
It's on your desktop, top right.
So it is. And we'll go back into undo blend.blend and Control Z. No, the undo is not shared across.
Is there an option to save the undo?
Probably. My other thing was got a note thing. I figured out. I've just remembered exactly where they come from.
Go on.
Old school musical sequences.
Yeah.
Literal plug-in. Pre-computers.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
That's exactly where they'll be coming from.
Modular
Modular synthesizers. Yeah.
There is an option for how many undos.
I really want to build modular synthesizer stuff. They're so expensive to sell.
I don't know.
Can you list your instructions? Can you see the things
See your
you're
history,
going to do?
The things you've already done.
Yeah.
I don't.
Some undos you can see a list of.
I don't know that you can. There might be. The other thing about Blender is that there's a massive plug-in repository for it. So if you can't, somebody will have written something that you
You
can.
can access the history with Control-Alt-Z.
Can you, by Christ? Control-Alt-Z. Yeah, look at that. Clear location was the last thing I did. So if I grab, it's gone now, so I'll ungrab it, and then Control-Alt-Z, 3 translates and a clear location. So that translates where I want it. Yes. Okay. I've only been using it for a decade and I didn't know.
That's the way software works.
That's the way this software works.
No, that's not even a. We cannot even call it use.
Yeah,
It's
there's
a
also-
mastermind.
I don't know if you've got it set, but there's a global undo, which includes changing different to different views.
Alright, okay, so if I go 137, Control Z, no.
Yeah, you
I
have to have
haven't
it on in the in your editing options. Options for
Oh, I have got it on.
So it's like
Global undo
save
works
actions done when you are not in edit mode, for example, duplicating objects, changing panel settings, or switching between modes.
Switching between modes. So if I go across a few modes to there. No. Oh, I know what that's saying. It's not saying that if I undo it, it'll undo the switching of the mode. It's saying that the undo
Will affect
is all that data is present in the other modes as
Yeah.
well.
Right. Yeah, I was just looking at it. And I was just seeing if it had the.
So yeah, it's a deep package, and it's been so long in the making. Really. As of version 2.5, and you might look at this user interface and go, that's fairly ugly. If you'd have seen it before 2.5, it was 100 times worse.
I remember when there was a bar across
Yeah,
the middle.
that
and you
bar
had the
across the
split,
middle, yeah.
this whole split
Yeah.
format. Oh my god, that hurt.
Well, you can still do a little bit of what you used to have to do all the time in old Blender, which is you can interact with the menus and the panels in the same way as you can interact with the 3D view. So I can zoom in and out on that, and I can pan it with the middle mouse, and there isn't enough there to pan. Let's open enough stuff here. I can pan it with the middle mouse as if I'm moving around in space, and you can zoom in and out like so.
Again, the consistency of the UI just blows my mind.
It seems like it must have been a design decision quite early on to say everything stays the same, regardless of where you are. The middle mouse button is for panning around. That's just what it is.
There isn't. It doesn't save.
No.
We've proven it, but it says there
You
it
can't-
does not save after you close the
Cannot
session.
save undo history. So anyway, that's my favourite piece of software in the world.